The night spread over the city like a dark blanket. The streetlights flickered in shades of yellow, reflecting off the wet asphalt from the rain that had fallen earlier. The sound of cars faded as the early morning hours approached, leaving behind only the distant echo of hurried footsteps and muffled conversations. For Ricardo, this was the best time of the day, when the world finally quieted down, ready to hear the music. He walked alone, his hands stuffed in his jeans pockets. The performance that night had been a huge success. The theater was packed, standing ovation, rave reviews. Ricardo Galliani's name was splashed across newspapers as the conductor of the moment. But strangely, none of that seemed to fill the emptiness he felt in his chest. Then he heard the melody. It came from a nearby alley, soft and melancholic, as if the notes were dancing in the air, carried by the cool wind. Ricardo stopped. The melody was familiar, too familiar. His heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran down his spine. Without thinking, he followed the sound, as if it were a call he couldn't ignore. On the corner, he saw a man sitting on the sidewalk, hunched over an old guitar. The worn-out strings creaked under his calloused fingers, but there was something about the way he played, something that made time slow down. The streetlight illuminated only part of his face, but Ricardo could make out his scruffy beard, deep-set eyes, and tattered clothes. The man played with his eyes closed, lost in his own music. Ricardo stood there, watching. The song wasn't just beautiful, it was intimate. He felt like he had heard it before, in some distant time, but his memory couldn't bring it back. The old musician finished the melody with a lingering chord, opened his eyes, and looked directly at Ricardo. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. There was something in that look. Something that made Ricardo quickly look away, as if he'd been caught peeking at a secret that didn't belong to him. He felt a tightness in his chest, an inexplicable discomfort. Without saying a word, he turned and kept walking. With each step he took, the melody continued echoing inside him. He tried to push it away, bury it beneath the applause of the night before, beneath the glory he'd earned after years of dedication. But the song refused to leave. When he finally reached his penthouse, Ricardo threw himself on the couch and closed his eyes. The silence of the night wrapped around him, but he could still hear the music in his mind, like a ghost from the past trying to speak to him. It was then that he realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had played a song for him. The morning sun streamed through the large glass windows of the penthouse, casting soft shadows across the cold floor. Ricardo woke up with the unsettling feeling that something was chasing him. The melody from the night before still lingered in his mind, like an annoying whisper, a memory that insisted on existing, but without form, without a face. He got out of bed, walked over to the grand piano in the center of the room, and, without thinking, pressed a few random keys, trying to recreate the chords he'd heard on the unknown man's guitar. But the notes slipped through his fingers, as if they belonged to another life. He sighed, slumping his shoulders. It had always been like this. That feeling of emptiness, of something lost between the years. Since he was a kid, he had learned to ignore that sensation, to fill it with music, discipline, and perfection. His adoptive mother used to say he had a gift, that music flowed through him like a river. But Ricardo had never told her that no matter how much he played, the water from that river always seemed to flow to a place he couldn't reach. He opened a drawer on his desk and pulled out a dark wooden box. Inside, there were only a few mementos from the past, a broken watch, a faded photograph, and a yellowed note. The photo showed a child with messy hair and alert eyes, sitting on a park bench. Behind him, a man held a guitar. The man's face was partially cropped out of the picture, but something about his posture, the way he held the instrument, reminded Ricardo of the musician from the night before. Ricardo furrowed his brow, trying to force his mind to dig deeper. But, as always, the memory slipped away like sand through his fingers. He remembered the orphanage, the cold nights spent staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine where he came from. He remembered the day he was adopted, the strange feeling of having a new family, a new name, a new life. But before that? Just fragments, like pieces of a puzzle with no edges. He pressed the photograph between his fingers and closed his eyes. An image appeared in his mind, a guitar being strummed under a reddish sky, a man singing softly, his voice raspy and comforting. The melody was soothing, like a hug made of sound. Ricardo's heart raced. He knew that scene. He'd been there, he'd heard that song. But where? When? The phone rang, snapping him back to the present. It was his assistant, reminding him of an important meeting. He quickly closed the box, burying the past once again. He dressed in a hurry, trying to shake off the persistent feeling, that tightness in his chest that had grown since the night before. But even as he walked out of the apartment, he could still hear the guitar chords playing somewhere forgotten in his mind. In the car, he watched the streets pass by through the glass, the unfamiliar faces, the city that applauded and celebrated his talent. He should have felt satisfied, complete. But instead, everything seemed like a well-rehearsed play, where he was just an actor reciting lines that no longer made sense. That morning, a decision began to take shape inside him. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to find the answers he had been avoiding for so long. He didn't know exactly where to begin. But he knew one thing for sure, that song would never leave his head. The sound of the guitar gently echoed through the gray streets. The early morning hours were fading, giving way to a sky painted in shades of orange and violet as the city woke up to another day. Sitting in a quiet corner of the park, Miguel strummed the worn strings of his instrument, his calloused fingers gliding over the rough wood. His raspy voice followed the melody in a near whisper, as if singing only to himself, to the memories that never left him. The world around him passed by too fast. Men in suits rushed by, mothers pulled their kids along by the hand, and young people laughed distractedly, eyes glued to their phones. For Miguel, it was all just a distant blur. The only thing that remained clear was the music, his last refuge, his only connection to a past that sometimes felt like it had been nothing more than a dream. He didn't know exactly how many years had passed since he lost everything. Time had become an abstract concept, something he measured not in days or months but in the number of times he'd played that same song, trying to keep alive the memory of the son who had been torn from him. The child's face still shone in his mind like a distant sun, but with each passing year, the features grew blurrier, like an old photograph slowly fading away. On the other side of the park, a man watched Miguel intently. Julio, a journalist for a cultural magazine, passed through the area almost every morning. He had always noticed the old musician, always heard the melancholic chords blending with the city's noise. But that day, something made him stop. There was something in the way Miguel played and raw emotion, a pain woven into each note. He knew there was a story here, one that needed to be told. With a notepad in hand, Julio slowly approached. Miguel, noticing his presence, looked up and simply nodded, as if he were used to the fleeting curiosity of strangers. "Can I sit down?" the journalist asked. Miguel shrugged and kept playing, his eyes lowered, focused on the melody. "I'm a journalist," Julio continued. "I'm writing an article about street musicians. I'd love to hear your story." The old musician let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. "My story," he said. "My friend, my story is just a handful of forgotten chords blown away by the wind." But for some reason, he kept going. Words began to spill out, hesitant at first, then more freely, as if the music that lived in his fingers was also buried in his voice. He told how, many years ago, he had a family. How he had loved a woman, and together, they had a son. A boy who was his world. He spoke of how everything changed after an accident separated them, how he searched desperately for the child, but found nothing. How time passed, and he was left behind, trapped in a world where only music remained. Julio listened intently, jotting down every detail. But when Miguel mentioned that his son had a natural gift for music, something clicked in Julio's mind. "Do you have a photo of him?" Julio asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Miguel hesitated. The only physical memento he had of his son was tucked away in a yellowed piece of paper, carefully folded in the pocket of his old coat. With trembling fingers, he pulled out the photo and handed it to the journalist. Julio took the picture and, as he unfolded it, his heart began to race. The boy in the photo looked incredibly familiar. The features, the expression, he had seen that face before. In the newspapers. In magazines. On posters plastered around the city, announcing the new tour of a renowned conductor. The conductor, Ricardo Galliani. Julio looked up at Miguel, who was watching his reaction with a mix of curiosity and quiet pain. The journalist took a deep breath, realizing he had just stumbled upon a story far bigger than he had imagined. A story of separation. Of music. Of a reunion that might still be possible. And for the first time in many years, Miguel felt a thread of hope stir within him. The cold afternoon wind blew through the busy streets, carrying with it the smell of freshly brewed coffee from nearby cafes. Ricardo wandered aimlessly, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his overcoat, trying to shake the unease that had been following him since the night he heard that melody in the alley. It was strange. Something inside him had been awakened, an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite name. He should have been in the studio, reviewing the score for his next concert. He should have been in a meeting with sponsors or giving interviews about his tour. But instead, there he was, walking without purpose, letting his steps guide him as if they were searching for answers his mind wasn't ready to face. That's when he saw him again. Miguel was sitting in the same corner of the park, the old guitar resting on his knees, his fingers gliding smoothly across the strings. The music was different from that night, but it carried the same weight, the same melancholy. Ricardo stopped a few yards away, watching. He felt the same shiver down his spine, the same strange familiarity that had made him hesitate before. This time, however, he didn't turn away. He approached slowly, not exactly sure what was driving him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange magnetism of that melody. Miguel looked up when he noticed Ricardo's shadow fall over him. His gaze was tired, yet sharp, as if he saw far beyond what was visible on the surface. "Beautiful music," Ricardo commented, crossing his arms. Miguel gave a brief smile, without stopping his playing. "Thanks. It's one of my own compositions. I wrote it for someone I lost." The words hit Ricardo like an invisible weight. Something inside him twisted, as if an old thread from the past had been suddenly pulled. He looked away, trying to mask the discomfort that hit him without warning. "You play really well," Ricardo continued, trying to steer the conversation in a different direction. "I used to play better," Miguel replied with a half-smile. "But life has a funny way of changing the sound of things, don't you think?" Ricardo didn't know what to say. He, who had mastered every measure of a symphony with precision, who conducted orchestras with firm, calculated gestures, suddenly felt small in front of a man with a battered guitar and an unknown story. Miguel studied Ricardo's face for a moment before returning to his playing. "Music has memory," he said, almost in a whisper. "Some songs never leave us. They stay inside, waiting to be heard again." Ricardo felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know why those words hit him so deeply, but he knew he needed to leave before that stranger managed to break through the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. "It was a pleasure listening to you play," he said quickly, stepping back. "I have to go." Miguel nodded, not seeming surprised. "Come back whenever you want, maestro." Ricardo froze. The man knew who he was. But how? He didn't ask. He simply turned and walked away, not looking back. But with every step, Miguel's melody followed him, like an insistent echo in his mind. And deep down, he knew that wouldn't be the last time he heard it. The next few days felt like ink smudges on paper, blurry, hard to distinguish. Ricardo found himself pacing back and forth, his hands always occupied with sheet music, but his mind drifting somewhere far away, somewhere just out of reach. Miguel's melody kept creeping into his thoughts, slipping into his dreams like a silent visitor, always on the edge of his memory, but never quite complete. At night, as soon as he closed his eyes, he was transported to another time. The feeling was vivid, almost tangible. He saw himself as a small child, barefoot on the cold pavement, sitting on a park bench. Beside him, a man with disheveled hair and an unshaven face played the guitar. The melody seemed to flow straight from the man's heart, warm, inviting. With his eyes closed, the boy felt safe, protected, as if there was nothing in the world to fear. But then, as always, the dream faded, and Ricardo woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, unable to remember enough to make sense of it. It felt like losing something precious. That man. Who was he? And why, even without seeing his face, did Ricardo know deep down that he meant something? The next morning, still shaken by the dream lingering in his mind, Ricardo sought out his adoptive mother, Helena. She had always been a steady presence in his life. She greeted him with her usual warm smile, but the moment he stepped into the room, she could tell something was off. "What's wrong, Ricardo?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. He sat down, struggling to find the right words. "Mom, I've been having these dreams. More like flashes, really. It's like something really old is trying to come back. I see someone playing the guitar for me. I don't remember much, but I feel like this person is important." Helena looked at him, as if choosing her words carefully. Then, with a sigh, she brushed a few strands of gray hair from her eyes. "Ricardo, I never really talked much about your past, did I?" she said, her voice softer now. "I knew that, sooner or later, you'd start asking questions." Ricardo watched her intently, his chest tightening. "You were found after an accident, Ricardo. Alone, wandering near a highway, close to a small town. We got a call from the orphanage. We don't know what happened to your biological parents. We don't know if you were abandoned or if something else happened." Her words hit him like an avalanche. He had always known he had no memories of his early childhood, but deep inside, he had felt there was more to it. Something hidden beneath the life he had built with Helena. The pain of not knowing whether his past was a story of loss or abandonment squeezed at his chest. I don't know what to say, Mom. You never told me this. I always felt like there was something more. Something you didn't want me to know." Helena took his hands in hers, her grip firm yet full of love. "I love you, Ricardo. And you are my son, no matter where you came from. But I knew this day would come. The truth is, you are the only fragment of a past we could never fully understand." He sat in silence, trying to absorb her words, feeling the emptiness inside him grow even larger. Who was he, really? Who was the man in his dreams, the one with the guitar? The sudden ring of the phone snapped him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, expecting a call about the upcoming concert, but the voice on the other end wasn't his agent. It was Julio, the journalist. "Ricardo, I have something important to tell you," Julio said, his voice tense. "I found a homeless man. A man who, well, he says he's your father." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He struggled to breathe. He turned to his mother, whose face had gone pale as she listened to the conversation. I need to see this man, Julio. Where is he?" The journalist explained that Miguel, the old musician, was at the park where he always played. And that he knew something that could change Ricardo's life forever. With barely a goodbye to his mother, Ricardo rushed out the door, his heart pounding, as fragments of memory and an overwhelming sense of anxiety took hold of him. He knew, deep down, that meeting this man would change everything. He could feel it. Miguel held the answers he had been searching for his entire life. The walk to the park felt longer than ever. Ricardo moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. With every step, he could sense something big, something irreversible, getting closer. The image of Miguel, playing his guitar on the street, was burned into his mind. And now, he knew he couldn't run anymore. Meeting the old musician wasn't just about curiosity, it was a turning point. He had no idea what he would find, but the feeling that he needed this truth had never been stronger. The park was quiet when he arrived. That same old guitar rested on Miguel's lap as his calloused fingers moved across the strings with a slow, melancholic grace. Ricardo stood still for a moment, watching the man. Miguel seemed oblivious to the world around him, lost in the music, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Ricardo took a deep breath, his eyes locked on the man who, somehow, he knew was the key to his past. He stepped forward slowly, unsure of what to say. The weight of the moment pressed against his throat, making it hard to speak. When Miguel finally looked up, his gaze softened, but he didn't stop playing. He knew the time for words was coming. "Miguel," Ricardo began, his voice quieter than he intended. "I need you to tell me your story. Everything. I know you're my father." Miguel's fingers froze on the strings, but he didn't look up right away. His eyes remained on the guitar, as if searching for an answer he wasn't ready to give. After a few long seconds, he finally lifted his gaze, heavier than Ricardo expected. The truth in his eyes was harder to bear than any words could have been. You recognized me?" Miguel whispered, his voice rough but thick with emotion, as if each word carried an unbearable weight. Ricardo nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah. I know. I saw you on the street, playing that same song. I recognized it. And now I need to know who you are. What happened? Where you've been? Where my father was." Miguel took a deep breath and, for a moment, stayed silent, his eyes lost in some distant place beyond Ricardo. The music had completely stopped. The pain was etched into every line of his weathered face, like a broken memory, with music as the only thread still keeping him connected to the world. Miguel finally began, his voice barely audible. "I had a son. He was everything to me. Life was cruel, kid. An accident tore us apart, and I searched for him for years. I looked on every street corner, in every stranger's face. But he was gone, like I had lost him forever. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to look. All I had left was the music." The weight of those words crashed over Ricardo like a storm. Something inside him cracked open, something he had always known deep down but had never been ready to accept. The man he had spent his whole life searching for, the man who might have been his father, was right in front of him. And he had been searching for Ricardo too. But now, there were no more words, only the echoes of shared pain, a grief that bound them together in a way Ricardo didn't know how to handle. Miguel closed his eyes, his fingers beginning to move over the strings again. "This song," he said, his voice trembling. "I wrote it for you. For my son. For the boy I lost. Every chord, every note, it tells our story." Ricardo couldn't speak. The words stuck in his throat, as if his mind was still trying to grasp an impossible truth. He watched Miguel play, and suddenly, the familiar melody wrapped around him like a distant embrace. It was the same song he had heard on the street, the same tune that had haunted him for weeks. Now, it all made sense. It was the last piece of a life that, maybe, had never truly been lived. Miguel played with his eyes closed, as if the guitar was the only thing he had left. Every chord seemed to stretch time itself, weaving pain and longing into the air, filling the silence with something almost too heavy to bear. Ricardo stood frozen, absorbing the music, absorbing everything it was trying to say, everything it meant to the man in front of him. The final song. The song of a father who never gave up. The song of a son who never found his way back. When the last note faded into the air, Ricardo remained still. He didn't know if he was ready to embrace this truth, but somehow, he already knew it was inside him. And Miguel, with a deep breath, looked at the sun staring back at him with tear-filled eyes. "I never stopped looking for you, son. Never." Ricardo couldn't hold back his tears anymore. Ricardo pulled away from Miguel, his steps hurried, his mind in turmoil. He had no idea what he was doing, no idea what he truly wanted. The sound of that final song still echoed in his head, a persistent refrain that refused to fade. Miguel's words were imprinted inside him, but the truth felt like a crushing weight he didn't know how to carry. How could he accept this? How could he believe that this man, with his worn-out guitar and the weathered face of someone who had lived too many hard years on the streets, was really his father? He stopped in the middle of the park, his hands shaking. The heavy, overcast sky seemed to mirror the storm raging inside him. Miguel's face, marked by years of suffering, his regret-filled gaze, everything played over and over in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The idea that his origins were so far removed from the life he had built, the orchestras, the elegant concert halls, the hard-earned fame, was unbearable. No. This can't be true. Ricardo kept repeating those words to himself as he walked aimlessly, his hurried pace clashing with the park's stillness. He couldn't comprehend it. He refused to accept it. The life he had built was solid, secure, and now he was supposed to believe that everything he knew about himself was a lie? That he was the son of a man who barely knew how to survive, a man who played music on the streets for spare change? No. It didn't make sense. He couldn't be Miguel's son. He just couldn't. The image of his adoptive mother flashed in his mind, and he thought about running to Helena, finding comfort in her. But deep down, he knew the doubt wouldn't go away. She couldn't erase the truth that had just been thrown at him. She couldn't undo Miguel's words. She couldn't give him back the certainty he had always had about where he came from. "This isn't possible," he muttered, still walking fast. "He's crazy. He has to be delusional." Ricardo stopped in the middle of the street, the sounds of the city muffled by the chaos inside his own head. He sat down on the edge of a small garden, trying to collect his thoughts, trying to find a logical explanation. But logic slipped through his fingers with every passing second, like something breaking apart inside him. Miguel's face, the way he had looked at him with such raw honesty, the chords of that song he had played with so much love, it was all weaving a web of emotions Ricardo didn't know how to unravel. "No. I'm not. I'm not that man. He can't be my father. He's not." He blurted out, his voice unsteady, trying to convince himself of something that was becoming harder to deny. Anger started rising inside him. Anger at himself. Anger at Miguel. Anger at this entire absurd situation that had no place in the life he had built. He stood up abruptly, pacing again, his thoughts even more chaotic than before. How was he supposed to accept a past so distant, so messy? How was he supposed to go back to the life he had built, to look at his adoptive mother, his friends, his colleagues, knowing that somewhere out there, a man was wandering the streets, calling himself his father? The road ahead felt endless. His anger twisted into anguish. His anguish blurred into confusion. He couldn't let go of what he had just heard, but he also couldn't surrender to the idea that his entire life, everything he was, might have been built on a lie. And then, even as his mind screamed at him to reject the thought, something deep inside whispered back. Something he didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. Something about that moment with Miguel had touched a part of him that refused to be silenced. A part of him was restless, resisting the idea of completely shutting out the man who claimed to be his father. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of doubt press against his chest. "No. I can't," he whispered, as if saying the words out loud could push away the feeling that he was losing himself. But no matter how hard he fought it, something inside Ricardo knew that this story wasn't over. Something told him that the answers he had always searched for were there, in Miguel's eyes, in the melody he played. Something was calling him to face the truth. But doubt, like a shadow, kept pulling him back. Without realizing it, Ricardo was standing at the edge of his own past. And the more he tried to run from it, the closer it came. The hospital was eerily quiet that morning, as if the world outside had momentarily ceased to exist. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle glow over the room where Miguel lay. His body looked even frilier than Ricardo remembered, but his eyes, the same ones that had looked at him with such pain and hope in the park, still shone with a light Ricardo never imagined he would see again. Miguel, though weakened by illness, was there, a serene smile on his face, as if he knew that, at last, the son he had lost was by his side once more. Ricardo stepped into the room cautiously, as if afraid of shattering something fragile. The man he now knew as his father was right in front of him, yet the reality was still difficult to embrace. They had found each other, but there was so much left unsaid. Still, everything seemed to boil down to one undeniable truth: Miguel was his father. And for the first time, Ricardo was truly here, with the chance to live something he had never had before. Miguel looked at him, his smile weak but genuine, reflecting a peace Ricardo could barely comprehend. Life, which had once seemed so distant and unattainable, now touched him with an intensity he could no longer ignore. He was here, in front of the man who had searched for him for so many years, and now, Ricardo knew that Miguel also felt that he had finally found him. "Son." Miguel spoke, his voice rough but filled with tenderness. "You came, you really came." Ricardo moved closer to the bed, his eyes misty, and knelt beside Miguel. He felt the weight of those words, their meaning embedded in every syllable, and a wave of emotion crashed over him, a mixture of regret and relief, pain and love. "I'm here, Dad," Ricardo said, his voice breaking under the overwhelming emotions he still didn't know how to control. "I'm here now." With effort, Miguel lifted his hand and touched Ricardo's arm, as if trying to feel him one more time, to engrave that moment into his memory. He smiled, but there was a lingering sadness in his eyes. "Son." "I have one last request," Miguel said, his voice carrying a surprising strength. "I want to see you conduct an orchestra. I want to watch you do what you were always meant to do. I want to see you move the world with your music, just like I did, as simple as it may have been. I want to see the son I found doing what he does best, before I go." Those words, heavy with meaning, hit Ricardo like an unexpected blow. He looked at Miguel, his heart tightening. Miguel knew his time was running out. He understood that this request was likely the last wish of a man who could finally look at his son with pride. Yet, at the same time, Ricardo felt an immense weight settle on his shoulders. How could he grant this request? He, who had always felt so distant from Miguel's simple and sincere music, how could he give himself to this moment? Miguel, sensing his hesitation, smiled gently and made a subtle gesture with his hand, as if to reassure him. "Please, son. Just once. I want to see you doing what you were always meant to do. Conducting, playing, being yourself. I just want to see my son happy." Ricardo, speechless, felt the weight of the request resonate deep within him. He knew what it meant. This wasn't just about conducting an orchestra. It was about giving Miguel a final glimpse of the son he had always dreamed of seeing, the son he had always believed in, even when Ricardo himself was lost. It was a chance to mend what was broken, to fill the emptiness he had unknowingly created. He took a deep breath, looking at Miguel, and then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it for you, Dad. I'll do it." That afternoon, Ricardo took Miguel to the concert. The city buzzed with energy, bright lights illuminating the streets, the excitement of the event filling the air. But for Ricardo, everything felt like it had slowed down. He wasn't nervous about conducting in front of a demanding audience, he was nervous because he knew this moment was far greater than any performance he had ever given. He glanced at Miguel, who sat in the audience, smiling with pride, like a man who, at last, was at peace. When the orchestra began to play, something inside Ricardo broke free. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the music and memory settle deep within his soul. For the first time, he wasn't conducting with just his mind, he was conducting with his heart. He could feel Miguel's presence in every note, hear the echoes of his guitar, the melody that had always been a part of him, now flowing through his baton. The music was no longer just his. It was theirs. Miguel's final song now resonated throughout the concert hall, and Ricardo finally surrendered to it. As the orchestra played, Ricardo felt Miguel's hands on his soul, felt the embrace of a love he had never fully understood until now. The stage became sacred ground, a place where father and son met for the last time, where the years of separation were mended by a melody that now bound them forever. When the final note was played, silence hung in the air for a brief, perfect moment. Ricardo looked at Miguel, who watched him with tears in his eyes. They didn't need words. They had already found each other. The stage lights reflected off their faces, and for the first time, Ricardo felt that he had accomplished something beyond human understanding. He had given Miguel what he had always longed for, the pride of seeing his son shine. And in that final moment, with the music still lingering in the air, Ricardo knew the cycle was complete. Miguel's last song, the melody that had united them, would echo in their hearts forever. The night was quiet, and the theater was slowly emptying, as if time itself had stopped within those walls. The concert had ended, but the weight of the music, the intensity of that moment, still lingered in the air. It was as if the space between the notes had become a bridge between father and son. Ricardo stood at the center of the stage, taking deep breaths, trying to process everything that had just happened. The music had answered questions he never asked, filling a void he hadn't even realized was there. Miguel, though frail, sat in the audience, his eyes locked onto Ricardo with immense, almost tangible gratitude. The last song he had heard wasn't just a melody, it was the soundtrack of his life. And now, seeing the son he had lost so long ago, he knew that somehow, fate had finally rewarded him. He had received what he wanted most, his son, standing before him, playing with his whole heart, doing what he was always meant to do. Music had reunited them, and now, Miguel wanted to make that bond eternal. Ricardo walked toward Miguel, his chest tight with emotion. He looked at the old man, whose eyes were brimming with tears yet softened by a peaceful smile, as if a lifetime of anguish had finally been put to rest. "Dad," Ricardo's voice trembled, struggling to find the right words for what he felt. He had given Miguel his music, but now, he wanted something more, something that would symbolize the reconciliation they had longed for yet never believed possible. I want to hear you play. One last time. Your song. The one that's always been yours. I want to hear you, Dad. Now." Miguel looked at him with a timid but understanding smile. He knew this would be the final moment, his last chance to give his soul completely to his son through music. Without speaking, he stood up with effort and walked toward the guitar resting beside the stage. His body was tired, his hands unsteady, but the fire in his eyes still burned just as fiercely. He took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of the instrument in his hands. Ricardo sat at the piano, but this time, there was no distance between them. This wasn't a performance, wasn't a formal concert. It was something intimate, personal, a moment where father and son could surrender to the music without rush, without pressure. Miguel positioned his fingers on the guitar and, with a sigh, began to play. The first note echoed softly through the empty theater, and without thinking, Ricardo followed with the piano's melody. The song was simple, yet filled with a depth that only those who had endured loss could truly understand. It was a song of love and pain, of years lost but also of hope. Each chord Miguel played seemed to fill the space around them, and every note Ricardo added to the piano reflected the journey of their hearts finally finding their way back to each other. They played as if time had stopped, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. Their connection transcended the music, transcended explanation. It was father and son finally understanding each other, finally meeting in a place where words were unnecessary. Every chord, every melody was a silent message, a promise that despite everything, love was the strongest song between them. Miguel, eyes closed, played as if it were his last time. And deep down, he knew it was. Fatigue consumed him, but the joy of having Ricardo beside him was immeasurable. He had done what he was meant to do. His final mission in life was to see the son he had lost, and now, that mission was complete. As the song neared its end, the theater seemed wrapped in a deep serenity, as if the universe itself was watching. Miguel glanced at Ricardo, who followed him on the piano, and with tears in his eyes, he smiled with gratitude. It was the smile of a father who could finally rest, knowing that his son was at peace and, more importantly, that he was now following music with his whole heart. The last note of the guitar was played, fading into the air like a gentle whisper. Silence filled the theater, leaving behind only the powerful feeling that something profound had just taken place. Ricardo and Miguel looked at each other, both now openly crying. They didn't need words. They had found each other, and nothing else mattered. As the final melody faded, Ricardo embraced Miguel, watching as he relaxed, closing his eyes for the last time with a peaceful smile on his face. He knew his father was gone, but there was no sadness in his heart. There was no grief, only the certainty that everything was finally as it should be. Ricardo felt a wave of gratitude and love so strong he couldn't put it into words. The old man, with his guitar, had given him the greatest gift of all. He had given his son the chance to reconnect with his past, with his roots, and to learn that music wasn't just a profession or a career. Music was the soul, the memory, the love. Miguel left that night, but his song did not. It would live on in every chord Ricardo played, in every performance he gave. Miguel's last song, the melody that reunited father and son, would forever be the music that sealed their destiny. And as Ricardo played the final notes of the song, he knew, without a doubt, that this was the beginning of a new cycle. His father's music would never fade. It would live on forever in his heart.